The storm had been building for 3 days, turning the Montana sky the color of old pewter and setting every animal within 50 miles on edge. Cooper Hale felt it in his bones as he guided his chestnut mare along the swollen creek bed that Thursday morning in late September 1874. That peculiar tension in the air that meant nature was preparing to unleash something terrible upon the world. He'd been riding the eastern boundary of the Mackenzie Ranch since dawn, looking for signs of the rustlers who'd been plaguing cattle operations throughout the territory all summer long. At 42, Cooper had the lean build and weathered face of a man who'd spent most of his adult life in the saddle-fighting wars, both declared and undeclared. His gray eyes missed nothing as they swept the broken landscape, and his hands never strayed far from the worn grip of the Colt .45 riding low on his hip. The war had made him cautious about everything. 5 hard years of Union cavalry service had taught him to read terrain like scripture, anticipate trouble before it showed its face, and never trust appearances when survival was at stake. But it was what came after Appomattox that had made him truly solitary. The fever that took his 8-year-old daughter Mary had broken something deep inside him that he wasn't entirely sure would ever heal properly. He could still see her sometimes in quiet moments when his guard was down. Mary with her corn silk hair and pigtails and that gap-toothed smile that could light up a room sitting on the porch of their little house outside Abilene. She'd been picking wildflowers the morning the sickness hit purple prairie violets that stained her small fingers like ink. The fever had come on sudden and fierce, burning through her tiny body, like wildfire through dry grass. Cooper remembered holding her hand as she lay dying, feeling the heat radiating from her skin, while he pressed cool cloths to her forehead and whispered prayers he wasn't sure he believed. Her last words had been, "Papa, don't be sad," spoken in a voice like rustling leaves, and then she was gone, leaving behind only the scent of wildflowers and a silence that seemed to swallow the world whole. He'd buried her next to her mother in the shadow of a massive cottonwood tree, and afterward he'd ridden west without looking back. The frontier was a good place for men who needed to forget, and Cooper had thrown himself into the work of staying alive in country that killed the careless and the weak without mercy or hesitation. The sound of rushing water brought him sharply back to the present moment. The creek was running higher than he'd ever seen it in 3 years of riding this territory brown with runoff from the mountains and thick with debris that spoke of serious flooding upstream. Cooper dismounted to let his horse drink, keeping one eye on the darkening clouds overhead, while his other hand checked the cinch strap from long habit. That's when he heard it, a sound like distant thunder, but deeper and more persistent, rolling across the valley with the relentless power of approaching cavalry. Cooper looked north toward the mountains and saw death itself coming down the valley like God's own judgment. The wall of water was 30 feet high and black as midnight, filled with the wreckage of everything that had stood in its path. Trees that had weathered 100 winters vanished beneath it like matchsticks. A homestead's red barn roof rode the crest like a ship on a dark sea, spinning lazily before being swallowed by the churning foam. Fence posts, wagon wheels, the bodies of livestock. Everything disappeared into the hungry maw of the flood. Cooper grabbed his horse's reins and scrambled up the muddy bank, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The mare reared in panic, her eyes rolling white as she sensed the approaching catastrophe. And for a terrifying moment, Cooper thought they'd both be swept away before they could reach higher ground. Then he saw her, and everything else faded into background noise. A child no more than 10 years old was caught in the middle of the torrent, her thin arms flailing desperately above the brown water as debris spun around her like the devil's own carousel. A fence post missed her head by inches. The bloated carcass of a steer rolled past, nearly knocking her under. She disappeared beneath the surface for what felt like an eternity, before bobbing back up, gasping and choking on muddy water. Her simple calico dress was torn nearly off her small frame. And even from 50 yards away, Cooper could see the raw terror in her dark eyes. She was screaming, but her voice was lost in the thunderous roar of the flood that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Cooper's cavalry training kicked in before his conscious mind could catch up. He stripped off his gun belt and boots with practiced efficiency, tied his horse's reins to a sturdy oak with hands that moved from muscle memory, and dove into the raging current without a moment's hesitation. The water hit him like a charging locomotive, spinning him sideways and dragging him under into a world of brown chaos. His lungs burned as he fought his way back to the surface, orienting himself by the sound of the girl's increasingly desperate cries. A wooden beam slammed into his shoulder, sending fire down his arm and nearly knocking him unconscious. Someone's kitchen table tumbled past, missing his skull by mere inches. Cooper could see her now, maybe 25 feet ahead and slightly to his right. The current was carrying them both downstream at a pace that would have terrified a racehorse. But Cooper angled toward her with powerful strokes, drawing on every ounce of strength built up from 2 decades of hard frontier living. She went under again, just as he reached her position. Cooper took a deep breath and dove blind into the murky water, his hands searching desperately until his fingers found torn fabric, then a small, frantically struggling arm. He hauled her to the surface with him, both of them breaking through together in an explosion of spray and gasping, choking breaths. "I got you," he shouted over the flood's deafening cacophony, water streaming from his hair. "Hold on tight, and whatever happens, don't let go." The girl wrapped her arms around his neck. With the desperate strength of someone who understood, this was her only chance at survival. Her small body was shaking violently, whether from cold or terror Cooper couldn't determine. Probably both, given what she'd been through. Fighting the current was like wrestling with some primordial beast that wanted nothing more than to drag them both to a watery grave. Cooper kicked toward the eastern bank, using every muscle in his body to battle water that seemed to have developed a malevolent intelligence of its own. His lungs felt ready to burst from the effort, and his arms ached as if he'd been lifting anvils for hours, but he kept swimming with grim determination. A massive cottonwood branch swept toward them like a battering ram, its broken end jagged as a cavalry saber. Cooper twisted sideways with reflexes honed by years of combat, feeling bark scrape against his cheek as the debris missed them by the width of a whisker. The girl whimpered against his neck, her small body pressed tight against his chest, like a frightened bird seeking shelter from a storm. They were getting close to the bank now, maybe 15 feet from relative safety, but the water was deepest here and moving with the speed of an express train. Cooper's boots touched bottom once, twice, then slipped on treacherous mud that seemed determined to send them tumbling back into the main current. For a heart-stopping moment, they both went completely under the girl's grip, tightening around his throat until he could barely breathe. The world became a brown nightmare of churning water and floating debris. And Cooper felt panic clawing at the edges of his mind like a living thing. Then his boots found solid purchase on the muddy bottom, and he lunged toward shore with everything he had left in reserve. He half-carried, half-dragged the girl up onto dry land, both of them collapsing in complete exhaustion on the muddy bank. They lay there for long moments, coughing up what felt like half the creek, while their bodies shook from cold and shock. The girl rolled onto her side, her dark hair plastered to her skull like wet silk, her lips blue beneath the coating of mud and debris. But her eyes were alert and aware, and most importantly, she was breathing. "You're safe now," Cooper said softly, gently pushing wet strands away from her face. "Whatever happened before, whatever brought you to this place, you're—" The words died in his throat as he got his first clear look at her injuries. Rope burns circled both her wrists like crude bracelets, the marks raw and recent enough to still weep clear fluid. Her ankles bore similar evidence of restraint, and there were finger-shaped bruises on her thin shoulders that spoke of rough handling by adult hands. This child hadn't simply been caught in a natural disaster. Someone had tied her up and deliberately left her in the path of the flood, using the chaos and destruction as cover for what could only be described as attempted murder. Cooper felt cold rage building in his chest, deadly and focused as a rifle barrel. He'd witnessed plenty of human cruelty during his years as a cavalry scout, enough to last several lifetimes and then some. but using a natural disaster to murder a defenseless child represented a new depth of evil that made his trigger finger itch with the desire for immediate justice. The girl tried to speak through chattering teeth, her voice barely audible over the continuing roar of floodwater. Finally, she managed to form words. "Please, help me. They'll come back." Before Cooper could ask who "they" might be, the sharp crack of a rifle shot echoed across the water, followed immediately by the distinctive whine of a bullet passing uncomfortably close to human flesh. Cooper rolled sideways without thinking, pulling the girl behind a fallen cottonwood log as bark exploded from the tree, where his head had been only seconds before. Through the tangle of branches, he could see 3 horsemen emerging from the tree line on the far side of the flood-swollen creek, moving with the predatory patience of wolves closing in on wounded prey. They were rough-looking men with hard faces and weapons held ready for immediate use. Bandanas were pulled up to hide their features from casual observation, but Cooper recognized the leader by his distinctive black hat and the arrogant way he sat his horse. Clay Reddick, a name whispered in saloons from Billings to Denver, usually followed by curses and hurried prayers for protection. Reddick was wanted for robbery, kidnapping, and worse across 3 territories. There was a substantial bounty on his head, dead or alive, posted by territorial authorities who'd grown tired of his depredations. The fact that he was here now actively hunting this specific child painted a picture Cooper didn't like one bit. "Stay down and don't move a muscle," he whispered urgently to the girl. She pressed herself flat against the muddy ground with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned hard lessons about staying invisible when dangerous men were near. Reddick's voice carried clearly across the rushing water, smooth as aged whiskey and twice as dangerous. "Cooper Hale, we know you're hiding over there. I can see your horse tied up to that oak tree." So they knew his name. That was troubling, but not entirely surprising. Cooper had made his share of enemies during his years as a cavalry scout and frontier lawman, and bad news traveled fast in the sparsely populated territories where everyone knew everyone else's business. "Send out the girl, Hale," Reddick continued with mock reasonableness. "And you can ride away from this unfortunate situation, with all your parts still properly attached to your body. Refuse and, well, accidents do happen near flood waters. Tragic, really, but these things can't be helped." Cooper quickly assessed his tactical situation, while keeping the girl safely behind cover. His gun belt was somewhere at the bottom of the creek, along with his boots, and any chance of fighting his way out of this confrontation through superior firepower. The girl was shivering against his side, but her eyes remained alert and focused despite everything she'd endured. Whatever horrors she'd survived, they hadn't broken her spirit or her will to live. "The girl stays with me." Cooper called back his voice, carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Find yourself another victim to terrorize." Reddick's laugh was like breaking glass, sharp and unpleasant. "She ain't no victim, Hale. That little girl is valuable property bought and paid for with good hard gold, and we've got papers to prove legal ownership. You're interfering with a legitimate business transaction here, and that makes you the criminal in this situation." The words hit Cooper like a physical blow to the solar plexus. Property, papers, legal ownership. These weren't simply outlaws looking for easy money or revenge. They were slavers operating in defiance of laws that had supposedly ended such practices forever after the recent war. The girl beside him wasn't a kidnapping victim. She was escaped human cargo, and that made her incredibly dangerous to their continued operations. Cooper felt the girl tugging at his sleeve with urgent fingers. She was pointing downstream toward a cluster of buildings barely visible through the rain and gathering mist. An abandoned farmstead maybe half a mile distant, with what appeared to be a large barn that might provide temporary shelter and defensive positions. "Can you run when I tell you to?" he asked quietly, studying the terrain between their current position and potential safety. She nodded with fierce determination, her jaw set with resolve that seemed impossible in someone so young. I ran away from them before. That's how I ended up in the water. Cooper looked at her more closely, seeing intelligence and courage beneath the fear that any rational person would feel in such circumstances. This child had already proven she could survive the unthinkable. Now they just had to survive a little longer. When I give the word, we're going to run for that barn as fast as our legs will carry us. Don't look back, don't slow down, and whatever happens, don't let go of my hand. Can you do that? She nodded again, gathering herself like a runner preparing for the race of her life. Go. They burst from cover together, Cooper scooping the girl into his arms as they sprinted across the muddy floodplain toward distant safety. Behind them, rifles cracked in rapid succession bullets, whining past their heads and kicking up explosive geysers of mud all around their fleeing forms. Cooper zigzagged as he ran, using cavalry tactics learned during long-range patrols to make them a more difficult target. The girl buried her face against his shoulder, trusting him completely with her life, while her small arms held tight around his neck, but not so tight as to interfere with his breathing or movement. A bullet tugged at his shirt sleeve close enough to burn the fabric. Another shattered a fence post directly ahead of them, sending wooden splinters flying like shrapnel. Cooper leapt over a fallen tree trunk, landed hard on the uneven ground, and kept running despite the fire building in his lungs and the protests from muscles already exhausted by the flood rescue. The barn loomed larger as they approached a weathered structure with gaps between its boards and doors hanging askew on rusted hinges. It wouldn't provide much protection against determined men with rifles, but it was considerably better than being caught in the open with no cover whatsoever. They reached the entrance just as another volley of shots rang out from the creek bank. Cooper dove through the doorway, rolled to absorb the impact of their landing, and came up in a defensive crouch with the girl safely positioned behind a pile of moldy hay bales. The barn smelled of old straw mouse droppings and the lingering ghosts of livestock that had once called this place home. Shafts of gray light filtered through gaps in the weathered boards, providing enough illumination for Cooper to assess their surroundings and potential defensive options. Feed troughs, rusted farm implements, a broken wagon wheel, and there, hanging from a wooden peg near what had once been a horse stall, was an old Spencer repeating rifle with a brass receiver that gleamed dully in the filtered light. Cooper grabbed the weapon and worked the lever action to check its mechanical condition. The action was smooth despite years of neglect, and when he opened the buttstock compartment, he found 6 metallic cartridges still in their tubular magazine. Not much against 3 armed men, but infinitely better than harsh language and good intentions. "Let me look at those rope marks," he said, gently pulling out his bandana while keeping one eye on the barn's entrance. The girl extended her wrists without hesitation, displaying a level of trust that both humbled and terrified Cooper. The burns were worse than he'd initially realized, deep gouges where hemp rope had bitten into her skin, with enough force to leave permanent scars. Someone had tied her up tight and left her that way for hours, possibly days. As he cleaned her injuries with water from his canteen, Cooper noticed something else that made his blood run cold. There, burned into the soft skin of her shoulder, like a cattle brand, was a crude symbol, 2 interlocking circles, with a vertical line passing through the center. Cooper had seen that mark before, discussed in hushed tones around garrison campfires and trading post bars. It belonged to an organization that operated in the wild country north of civilized settlements, well beyond the reach of territorial law enforcement. They called themselves traders and entrepreneurs, but everyone knew what they really dealt in: human cargo. Men, women, and children bought, sold, and transported like livestock to buyers who didn't ask awkward questions about legal documentation. "How long were you with them?" Cooper asked as gently as possible, not wanting to cause additional trauma, but needing to understand what they were facing. 3 weeks, maybe 4. Her voice was steady despite everything, but Cooper could hear the tremendous effort it required. Hard to keep track of time when there aren't any windows to see the sun. "And before that, where did you come from originally?" Her young face clouded over with emotions too complex for someone her age to properly process. I lived in Dusty Creek with my father. Something in her tone made Cooper look up sharply from bandaging her wounds. There was pain there, but also anger and betrayal that went far deeper than simple kidnapping could explain. What happened? How did you end up with the slavers? Before she could answer, the sound of approaching horses echoed outside the barn walls. Reddick and his men had found a way across the swollen creek, and they were closing in for what would undoubtedly be the final confrontation. The girl suddenly reached into the torn hem of her dress, her small fingers working with desperate urgency at what Cooper had assumed was simply damaged fabric. She pulled out a small object wrapped in oilcloth and pressed it into his palm with trembling hands. "Keep this safe," she whispered, her dark eyes reflecting depths of knowledge no child should possess. "It proves everything. It shows what really happened." Cooper unwrapped the cloth carefully, revealing a tarnished silver locket no bigger than a $50 coin. He opened it with his thumbnail, expecting to see a family portrait or perhaps a pressed flower, some innocent keepsake from happier times. Instead, he found himself staring at a photograph that made his world tilt on its axis. The girl in the picture was younger, maybe 7 or 8 years old, but it was definitely the same child now crouched beside him in this abandoned barn. She was sitting on the front steps of what looked like a sheriff's office, and the man's arm around her shoulders, the man smiling down at her with obvious paternal affection, was Sheriff Eldon Sharp of Dusty Creek. Cooper's mind reeled as implications crashed over him like successive waves. Sharp was her father. But that raised more questions than it answered, each one more disturbing than the last. Why would outlaws risk everything to capture and kill a sheriff's daughter? Sharp had built his reputation as an incorruptible lawman, tough on crime and corruption, feared by criminals throughout the territory, unless that reputation was nothing more than an elaborate facade. Cooper thought back to conversations he'd had over the past year, fragments of information that had seemed unimportant at the time. Stories of missing travelers along certain routes. Homesteads found mysteriously abandoned, their occupants simply vanished without a trace. And always, Sheriff Sharp had been quick to declare them victims of Indian raids or wild animal attacks, closing investigations before they could gather momentum. But what if there had been another explanation? What if someone with a badge and legal authority had been deliberately covering up evidence of human trafficking? "Your father," Cooper said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sound of approaching hoofbeats. "He's Sheriff Sharp of Dusty Creek." The girl's face twisted with an emotion far too complex and bitter for someone her age to properly carry. "He was my father, before he sold me to pay his debts." The words hung in the smoky air between them, like a death sentence pronounced by the most impartial judge in the universe. Cooper stared at her, seeing terrible truth reflected in those dark eyes that had witnessed more betrayal than most adults would experience in an entire lifetime. This wasn't about outlaws targeting a lawman's family for revenge. This was about a corrupt sheriff who'd gotten in too deep with the wrong people and chosen to pay his debts with his own daughter's freedom and innocence. "Tell me what happened," Cooper said, checking the Spencer's action one more time as boots splashed through puddles outside their temporary refuge. She took a shaky breath, organizing thoughts that no 10-year-old should have to carry. Father owed them money. A lot of money. They'd been paying him gold to look the other way when people went missing along the territorial roads. But then something went wrong, a wagon train that disappeared important people from back east, asking difficult questions. The territorial governor sent investigators, and when the heat got too intense, they wanted their money back, plus interest for the additional risk. When Father couldn't pay, she couldn't finish the sentence, but the implications were clear enough. Cooper felt physically sick as the full scope of Sharp's betrayal became apparent. A father selling his own child to save his own skin represented evil in its most distilled form, the kind of corruption that poisoned everything it touched. Outside, the horses had stopped moving. Cooper could hear men's voices conferring in low, urgent tones as they planned their final assault. They were being systematically surrounded, and there would be no escape once Reddick's men had positioned themselves properly. The flood. Cooper said as understanding dawned like sunrise over a battlefield. It wasn't supposed to be a rescue situation. The girl shook her head with weary knowledge that belonged on the face of someone decades older. Father told them about the dam upstream, how the recent rains had weakened the structure beyond repair. They figured if I drowned in the flood, it would look like a tragic natural disaster. Father could play the grieving parent, and no one would ever suspect the truth, except she'd survived against impossible odds. And now she represented living proof of corruption that went all the way to the top of territorial law enforcement in this region. Reddick's voice carried through the barn walls with mock politeness that fooled no one. "We know you're in there, Hale. This doesn't have to turn into a bloodbath. Just send out our property and ride away like nothing happened." "And if I refuse," Cooper called back, already knowing the answer but needing to buy time to formulate some kind of plan. "Then you burn with her. Your choice, cavalry boy." As if to emphasize the threat, the smell of smoke began to drift through the gaps in the weathered boards. They were setting fire to the barn, planning to smoke out their quarry like wolves from a winter den. It was a time-tested tactic, and it would be devastatingly effective in this situation. Cooper grabbed the Spencer rifle and quickly counted his remaining options. 6 shots against 3 armed men with a burning building at his back and a child to protect. He'd faced worse odds during cavalry actions in the war, but not by much and never with such personal stakes involved. "Listen carefully," he said urgently, grabbing the girl's shoulders and looking directly into her eyes. "When the shooting starts, I want you to crawl toward that back wall and look for any way out of here. Don't wait for me. Don't look back. Whatever happens, don't let them take you alive." She shook her head with stubborn determination. "I'm not leaving you behind. You have to. That locket proves what your father did to you. Without that evidence, he gets away with everything and probably continues selling other people to save his own worthless hide." The smoke was getting thicker now, and Cooper could hear the ominous crackle of flames beginning to eat through dry wood that had been seasoned by years of prairie wind and sun. They had maybe 3 minutes before the barn became a death trap, with no possibility of escape. A shadow moved past one of the gaps in the front wall, followed immediately by another. Cooper tracked them with the Spencer's barrel, waiting for a clear shot that would give them maximum tactical advantage. The first target appeared in the doorway, moving fast and low. Cooper's first shot took the man in the shoulder, spinning him around with a cry of pain and surprise. Not a killing shot, but enough to take him out of the immediate fight. "Back wall now," Cooper shouted over the echoing gunshot. The girl scrambled toward the rear of the barn as Cooper worked the Spencer's lever to chamber a fresh cartridge. The flames were climbing the walls now, sending waves of intense heat washing over everything in the enclosed space. Burning hay began falling from the loft above, and smoke made Cooper's eyes stream, involuntary tears. 2 more shadows flitted past the gaps in rapid succession. Cooper fired twice, forcing them to take cover, but not scoring any decisive hits. He was down to 3 rounds, and the fire was spreading with terrifying speed through the dry-aged timber. A rifle cracked from outside, and splinters exploded from a support post near Cooper's position. Then, another shot from a different angle, confirming that they were completely surrounded, with no easy avenue of escape. "There's a window," the girl called from the back wall, her voice barely audible over the roaring flames. "But it's too high up." Cooper fired his 4th shot at a muzzle flash, then sprinted to help her. The window was indeed problematic, 7 feet off the ground, and barely wide enough for a grown man to squeeze through. The girl might be able to climb up and get out, but Cooper would have to follow, and that would leave their backs exposed during the most vulnerable part of any escape attempt. He boosted her up first, watching as she wriggled through the narrow opening with the natural agility of youth. Then he heard the thunder of hoofbeats circling around the outside of the barn, closing off their escape route before they could take advantage of it. Cooper smashed out the remaining glass with the Spencer's butt and hauled himself through the window opening by main strength. He landed hard in the mud outside, still clutching the rifle just as Clay Reddick himself appeared around the corner of the burning building. The outlaw leader had his rifle aimed and ready, but Cooper's cavalry reflexes were faster. The Spencer boomed one final time, and Reddick spun sideways with a scream of pain, his weapon flying from suddenly nerveless hands. "Run!" Cooper shouted to the girl, grabbing her hand as they sprinted toward their only remaining avenue of escape. They fled toward the creek, which had now become their salvation rather than their nemesis. Behind them, the barn collapsed in a spectacular shower of sparks and burning timber, lighting up the darkening evening sky like some hellish beacon visible for miles in every direction. The creek had subsided somewhat since the morning's catastrophic flooding, but it was still running high and dangerously fast, filled with debris that could batter them unconscious or drag them under to drown in the muddy depths. Cooper could see tree branches and pieces of destroyed buildings spinning in the current, any one of which could prove fatal if it struck them at the wrong angle. A rifle cracked behind them, and mud sprayed up near Cooper's boots as Reddick's remaining men gave pursuit. They'd be within effective range in a matter of seconds, and there was no cover between their current position and the water's edge. Cooper reached the creek bank and turned to the girl with desperate urgency. "Can you swim well enough to handle this current?" She nodded, though her face was pale with justified fear of the raging water that had nearly killed her once already that day. "Stay as close to me as possible. Don't try to fight the current, just let it carry us downstream away from immediate danger. If you see anything large coming toward us, take a deep breath and duck under, let it pass overhead." They plunged into the cold, fast-moving water together, Cooper keeping one protective arm around the girl as the current seized them and swept them away from their pursuers. The water was shockingly cold, leaching body heat at a dangerous rate, and filled with debris that battered them continuously as they were carried along. A jagged fence post tumbled end over end directly toward them, its pointed end gleaming like a spear in the fading light. Cooper pulled the girl under just as it passed overhead, so close he could feel the displacement of water from its passage. They surfaced together, both gasping and coughing on muddy water. "You all right?" he asked, treading water while scanning for the next hazard. She nodded gamely, though her lips were already turning blue from the cold. The water was leaching heat from their bodies at an alarming rate, and hypothermia would become a serious threat if they didn't get out soon. A broken wagon wheel spun toward them like a deadly discus. This time, the girl saw it coming first and dove on her own initiative, showing quick reflexes and excellent judgment under pressure. She was learning to read the water's moods, adapting her survival instincts to this new environment. The current carried them around a sharp bend, temporarily putting the burning barn and their immediate pursuers out of sight. But Cooper could hear horses splashing in the shallows behind them, which meant Reddick's men were following along the bank, probably hoping to pick them off when they tried to reach shore. Cooper spotted a promising tangle of fallen trees ahead, their interwoven branches creating a natural barrier across part of the creek's width. If they could reach it without being swept underneath and trapped, it might provide cover long enough to plan their next tactical move. "That pile of logs," he called to the girl over the water's continuous roar. "We're going to grab hold and use them for shelter." She nodded, understanding, swimming with strong, efficient strokes despite her small size and obvious exhaustion. They hit the log jam together, Cooper catching a thick branch while the girl wrapped both arms around a smaller trunk. The water tried desperately to pull them under the tangle, but the timber held firm against the current's relentless pressure. From their position among the logs, Cooper could see two horsemen splashing through the shallows, maybe 50 yards upstream. One of them was Clay Reddick himself, his left arm hanging useless at his side, but his face twisted with murderous rage that transcended any mere business transaction. "End of the line, hail." Reddick shouted over the water's noise, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. Send me that girl, and I'll make your death quick and relatively painless. Otherwise, I'll take my time with both of you." Cooper pulled the girl behind the largest log using the massive trunk as cover, while he studied their tactical situation with a professional eye. The creek bank was maybe 30 yards away, an easy swim in calm water, but potentially fatal with the current running so strong and debris still tumbling past at regular intervals. "I'm going to create a distraction," he told the girl quietly, his lips close to her ear. "When I do, I want you to swim for that big cottonwood on the far bank. Don't stop, don't look back, and don't wait for me." Before she could voice the protest, he could see building in her eyes. Cooper hauled himself up onto the log jam, making himself a clear target, silhouetted against the darkening sky. "You want me, Reddick? Stop hiding behind your men and come take me yourself." Both outlaws fired simultaneously, their bullets splintering wood all around Cooper's exposed position. He dove sideways, rolling along the logs, as more shots cracked out the muzzle flashes bright in the growing darkness. The girl slipped into the water and began swimming for the distant shore, her small form barely visible in the gathering gloom. Cooper waited until she was halfway across before making his own desperate break for safety. He slipped into the current and let it carry him downstream while the outlaws reloaded their attention, focused on the spot where he disappeared. The water was even colder now, and Cooper's muscles were beginning to cramp from the extended exposure to near-freezing temperatures. Fighting hypothermia and exhaustion, he struggled toward the eastern bank, using every technique learned during river crossings in enemy territory. His boots found muddy bottom, just as his endurance finally gave out completely, and he crawled up onto dry land like some prehistoric creature emerging from primordial seas. The girl was waiting for him behind the massive cottonwood he'd indicated, helping to pull him those final crucial feet to relative safety. Her small hands were surprisingly strong, and her presence gave him the motivation needed to keep moving when his body wanted nothing more than to collapse. "They're crossing upstream," she whispered urgently, pointing toward where the outlaws were forcing their horses into the treacherous shallows. Cooper nodded grimly, gathering himself for what he knew would be the final decisive confrontation. He was exhausted, hypothermic, and armed with nothing more than a folding knife on his belt. But he'd survived 5 years of cavalry warfare, the loss of his family, and a decade of hard living on the frontier. He wasn't about to let corrupt lawmen and their outlaw partners destroy this brave child's only chance at justice. "Stay hidden no matter what happens," he told her firmly. "If something goes wrong, if I don't make it out of this, you take that locket and get it to someone in authority who can't be bought. Understand?" She nodded solemnly, and Cooper could see steel in her spine despite everything she'd endured. Reddick and his remaining companion reached the bank 50 yards downstream, their horses blowing hard from the effort of crossing the dangerous current. Cooper could see them conferring in low voices, probably deciding on the best approach for their final hunt. Cooper moved through the riverside willows like a phantom, using skills learned during long-range reconnaissance patrols to get close without being detected. Every shadow was potential cover, every sound a possible warning of approaching danger. The outlaws had dismounted and were moving carefully through the brush rifles held ready for immediate use. Cooper got within striking distance of the second man, a thin, nervous-looking fellow with tobacco-stained teeth and darting eyes, before making his decisive move. He came up behind the outlaw like a hunting cat, clamping one hand over the man's mouth while his knife found the space between ribs with surgical precision, learned in 100 similar encounters. The man dropped silently, but Reddick heard something anyway. Years of outlaw life had given the gang leader instincts nearly as sharp as Cooper's own, honed by constant danger and the knowledge that a single mistake meant death or territorial prison. "I know you're out there, Hale," Reddick called softly, his voice carrying clearly through the evening stillness. "Why don't we finish this proper, like man-to-man, face-to-face, no tricks or cavalry tactics?" Cooper melted back into the shadows without responding, letting uncertainty and fear do their work on his opponent's nerves. Psychological warfare was just as important as physical combat, and Cooper intended to use every advantage available to him. He circled around through the dense undergrowth, approaching from a completely different angle. Reddick was good. Cooper had to acknowledge that professional fact. The outlaw leader moved through the brush with the fluid grace of someone born to this kind of deadly game rifle, held ready eyes constantly scanning for the slightest hint of movement or ambush. But Cooper was better. 20 years of hard frontier living had honed his skills to a razor's edge, and he was fighting for something far more important than money, reputation, or personal survival. He was fighting for a child's life and the possibility of justice in a world that too often favored the strong over the innocent. Cooper made his move when Reddick passed beneath a low-hanging willow branch, the natural cover providing perfect concealment for what needed to be done. He dropped from the tree like an avenging angel, landing squarely on the outlaw's back and driving him face first into the muddy ground with bone-jarring impact. Reddick's rifle went flying, but the man was stronger and more resilient than Cooper had anticipated. He rolled sideways with surprising speed, throwing Cooper off balance, and came up with a Bowie knife gleaming wickedly in his right hand. "Should have minded your own business, cavalry boy." Reddick snarled, circling like a predator evaluating its prey. Blood trickled from his nose and mouth, but his eyes remained focused and dangerous. "That girl belongs to us. We always collect what's ours. Always." Cooper pulled his own knife, a smaller blade, but wickedly sharp and perfectly balanced for this kind of close-quarters combat. "She belongs to herself, and she always has. That's something a piece of garbage like you will never understand." They came together in a rush of steel and desperate fury, both men fighting for their lives in the mud beside the swollen creek. Reddick was bigger and stronger, with the physical advantages that came from years of hard criminal living. But Cooper was faster and infinitely more experienced in this type of lethal encounter. Reddick lunged with the Bowie knife, a killing stroke aimed directly at Cooper's heart. Cooper twisted sideways with reflexes honed by countless similar situations, feeling the blade part the fabric of his shirt as it missed by mere inches. He drove his own knife upward, seeking the soft spot beneath Reddick's ribs, where a properly placed blade would find vital organs. The outlaw leader gasped as steel bit deep, his eyes going wide with shock, and the sudden understanding that this fight was already over. He staggered backward several steps, looking down at the growing red stain spreading across his shirt with something approaching surprise. But Reddick wasn't finished yet. With the desperate strength of a dying man, he launched himself forward in one final attack, the Bowie knife sweeping toward Cooper's throat in a last attempt at mutual destruction. Cooper caught the outlaw's wrist in both hands, using leverage and superior positioning to twist the weapon away from its target. They grappled in the muddy shallows, both men's feet slipping on the treacherous footing while they fought for control of the deadly blade. Finally, Cooper managed to break Reddick's grip and send the Bowie knife spinning away into the darkness. The outlaw leader collapsed to his knees, both hands pressed against the wound in his side as his life slowly leaked away into the muddy creek water. "Damn!" Reddick wheezed, his voice barely audible over the sound of rushing water. "Always figured I'd go out in a blaze of glory, not bleeding to death in the mud like some stuck pig." Cooper knelt beside his dying opponent, cleaning his own blade on a handful of wet grass. "Any last words?" "Anything you want to say before you meet your maker?" Reddick coughed, blood speckling his lips as his breathing became increasingly labored. But his eyes remained focused, and there was still enough strength left for one final revelation. "Tell Sheriff Sharp." He gasped, each word requiring tremendous effort. "Tell him we kept our part of the bargain, even when everything went to hell. The girl was supposed to die in that flood just like he wanted. Clean and simple, no questions asked." Cooper felt his blood turn to ice water as the full implications became clear. "Sharp planned this from the beginning?" "Course he did." Reddick whispered with what might have been a smile. "Whole thing was his idea. Use the flood to get rid of the evidence, play the grieving father, and nobody would ever know he'd sold his own daughter to pay his gambling debts. The outlaw leader's eyes lost their focus, and his breathing stopped entirely. Clay Reddick was dead, but his final words had provided the last piece of evidence Cooper needed to understand the full scope of Sharp's corruption. Cooper checked both bodies thoroughly, gathering their weapons and any useful supplies for the journey back to Dusty Creek. Then he found their horses grazing nearby and selected the best mount for what would be a long, cold ride through the night. The girl emerged from her hiding place when Cooper whistled the all-clear signal. She looked at the dead outlaws, without flinching, her young face hard, with knowledge that belonged on someone decades older. "Is it really over?" she asked quietly. "Almost," Cooper replied, helping her onto the horse behind him. "One more thing we need to take care of back in town." They rode through the night under a canopy of stars, Cooper fighting exhaustion and hypothermia, while the girl dozed fitfully against his back. By the time dawn painted the eastern horizon with shades of gold and crimson, they were in sight of Dusty Creek's main street. The town was just beginning to stir as they rode down the central thoroughfare, Cooper leading Reddick's horse with the outlaw's body draped across the saddle. Word spread quickly through the small community Cooper Hale had returned from the flood with a rescued child and a dead desperado. A crowd gathered as they stopped in front of the sheriff's office, faces showing curiosity, concern, and growing confusion as they tried to make sense of what they were seeing. Cooper could identify most of them: storekeepers, ranchers, the preacher's wife, children peering out from behind their parents' protective bulk. And there, stepping out of his office with a carefully prepared expression of relief and official concern, was Sheriff Eldon Sharp himself. Sharp was a big man in his mid-50s, well-dressed and radiating the kind of authority that came from 15 years of wearing a badge. His graying hair was neatly trimmed, his mustache precisely groomed, and his clothes spoke of prosperity and respectability. He looked exactly like what he claimed to be: an honest lawman, genuinely concerned about the welfare of his constituents. "Yeah, Cooper," he called out, hurrying forward with apparent relief flooding his features. "Thank God Almighty you found her. When we heard about the dam breaking upstream, we feared the absolute worst." The crowd murmured sympathetic agreement, their faces showing genuine concern for what they assumed was simply a flood victim who'd been fortunate enough to find rescue. Here was their trusted sheriff, clearly worried sick about a missing child, grateful beyond words to the hero who'd brought her home safely. Cooper dismounted slowly, every movement carefully calculated for maximum dramatic impact. Then he helped the girl Sarah down beside him, her small hand finding his for support and comfort as she faced the man who'd betrayed her so completely. "Sheriff Sharp," Cooper said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the morning stillness. "I believe this young lady belongs to you." Sharp's expression flickered just for the briefest instant, but Cooper's experienced eyes caught the moment of calculation, and the split second when the corrupt lawman considered his options and chose his next move. "Of course she does," Sharp said with what sounded like genuine paternal emotion. "Sarah, sweetheart, are you hurt? We've all been worried sick about you since the flood started." Sarah looked up at her father with eyes that held no trace of warmth, affection, or trust. When she spoke, her voice was flat and emotionless as winter stone. "Hello, Father," she said simply. "I survived." The crowd shifted uneasily, sensing undercurrents they couldn't quite identify or understand. This wasn't the joyful reunion they'd expected to witness between a concerned parent and his rescued child. Cooper reached into his pocket and withdrew the silver locket, holding it up for everyone in the gathered crowd to see clearly. The tarnished metal caught the morning sunlight, drawing every eye to this small but obviously significant piece of evidence. "I found this sewn into her dress hem," Cooper announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the growing crowd. "Your picture's inside, Sheriff, along with something else that tells quite a story." He opened the locket with deliberate ceremony, revealing not just the family photograph, but also the carefully folded piece of paper that Sarah had hidden there during her captivity. She'd drawn it in secret during the darkest hours of her imprisonment, using charcoal and her own blood when necessary. A crude but accurate map showing the exact location of the slaver camp, along with a detailed list of names. Names that included Sheriff Eldon Sharp in Sarah's childish but unmistakable handwriting. She drew this map while she was being held captive. Cooper said, his voice carrying absolute authority and conviction. Shows where they kept her imprisoned. Shows exactly who was involved in the operation. Sharp took an involuntary step backward, his hand moving unconsciously toward the gun on his hip. But Cooper was faster and more experienced. His own Colt recovered from one of the dead outlaws, already halfway clear of its holster, in smooth anticipation of exactly this moment. "I wouldn't." Cooper warned, his voice carrying the deadly quiet tone of a man prepared to use lethal force. Not with all these witnesses watching. Behind them, Clay Reddick's body stirred slightly on the horse's back. Cooper had been extremely careful to ensure that the outlaw leader was severely wounded, but still alive, because a living witness was infinitely more valuable than a dead one when it came to exposing corruption. Reddick lifted his head with visible effort, his face pale from blood loss, but his eyes still sharp with the kind of malice that transcended ordinary human emotion. When he spoke, his voice was weak, but clearly audible to everyone in the crowd. "Tell them, Sheriff." He slurred through lips stained with his own blood. "Tell them how you owed our organization money. Tell them exactly how you chose to pay your debts when the gold ran out." The crowd began to murmur with growing confusion and horror, as the implications of what they were hearing began to penetrate their understanding. These were fundamentally decent people, many of them parents themselves, and the idea of what was being suggested was almost beyond their capacity to believe. "It's not what you think," Sharp said desperately, his carefully maintained facade beginning to crack under the pressure of public exposure. He looked around frantically at faces that had once shown him nothing but respect and trust, seeing that respect evaporating in real time. "I was working undercover, trying to gather evidence against their entire operation. You sold me." Sarah said, her clear young voice cutting through her father's increasingly frantic excuses like a knife blade through silk. Each word fell into the morning silence with the finality of stones dropped into still water. "When they came to collect their money and you couldn't pay, you gave me to them instead. You told them they could do whatever they wanted to me as long as no one could trace it back to your name." The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. Cooper could see the exact moment when the crowd's shock and confusion crystallized into pure, undiluted rage. The kind of fury that decent people felt when confronted with evil so complete and incomprehensible that it challenged their faith in basic human nature. Deputy Marshal Tom Crawford, an honest man who'd served under Sharp for 5 years and trusted him completely, stepped forward with his hand resting on his weapon. But he wasn't preparing to draw on Cooper or defend his sheriff. He was positioning himself to arrest the man he'd once considered a mentor and friend, a Jesus Christ Eldon. Crawford said, his voice thick with disgust and the kind of betrayal that cut straight to the bone. "Please tell me this isn't true. Tell me you didn't really sell your own daughter to those monsters." Sharp looked around the circle of increasingly hostile faces, seeing his carefully constructed reputation crumbling like a house built on sand. There was no escape route, no way to talk his way out of this situation. No clever excuse that would restore the trust he'd spent 15 years building. Too much evidence. Too many witnesses. Too much truth exposed in the harsh, unforgiving light of a Montana morning. "I didn't have any other choice," he whispered, his voice barely audible, even in the complete silence. "They would have killed me if I couldn't pay. It was either her life or mine, and God help me, I chose to save myself." The confession hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow to the solar plexus. Women gasped and covered their mouths in horror. Men stepped forward with their fists clenched and murder in their eyes. Someone in the back of the crowd shouted, "Hang the bastard!" And others immediately took up the cry with increasing volume and intensity. But Cooper held up his hand in a gesture that somehow commanded immediate attention and respect. Something in his manner, the quiet authority of a man who'd seen enough violence to last several lifetimes, made the angry crowd pause in their headlong rush toward vigilante justice. "There'll be a proper trial," Cooper said firmly, his voice carrying absolute conviction and moral authority. "Legal and legitimate, conducted according to territorial law. That's what separates civilized people from the kind of animals we're dealing with here." Crawford nodded agreement, pulling out his handcuffs with hands that shook slightly from suppressed emotion. "Eldon Sharp, you're under arrest for conspiracy corruption accessory to kidnapping and attempted murder of your own child. You have the right to remain silent, though I reckon you've already said more than enough." As Sharp was led away in shackles, his head hanging in shame and his career in ruins, Cooper knelt down to Sarah's eye level. She'd been through more horror and betrayal than most adults could survive, but there was unmistakable steel in her spine and unquenchable fire in her dark eyes. "What happens to me now?" she asked, watching her father disappear through the jail's heavy wooden door. Cooper looked down at this remarkable child who'd survived betrayal by her own parent, weeks of slavery, and a flood that should have killed her. She deserved infinitely better than the hand fate had dealt her. She deserved someone who would fight for her, protect her, and never allow her to be hurt again. "Well," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "I've got a small ranch outside town. Nothing fancy or elaborate, but there's definitely room for 2 people. If you don't mind sharing the space with an old cavalry scout who tells too many war stories." Sarah's smile was small but genuine, the first expression of real happiness Cooper had seen from her since pulling her from the floodwater. "I think I'd like that very much," she said simply. As they walked away together down the dusty main street, Cooper felt something he hadn't experienced in over 5 years, genuine hope for the future. Not just for Sarah, but for both of them together. They'd found each other in the absolute worst possible circumstances, but sometimes the strongest and most enduring families were forged in fire and hardship rather than born from blood and comfortable tradition. It wouldn't be easy, Cooper knew that with complete certainty. Sarah would have nightmares for months, possibly years, as she processed the trauma of betrayal and abuse. Cooper would have to learn how to care for a child again, how to open his heart to the possibility of love, an inevitable loss that came with any deep emotional attachment. But they'd face those challenges together, drawing strength from each other and from the unbreakable bond forged in floodwater, shared danger, and the kind of trust that could only be earned through actions rather than mere words. The town would eventually recover from the shock of discovering that their trusted sheriff had been corrupt to his very core. Justice would be served through proper legal channels with Sharp facing territorial courts and almost certain execution for his crimes. The slaver operation would be permanently shut down, its members hunted to the ends of the earth by federal marshals who took a dim view of human trafficking. And in a modest house on the outskirts of Dusty Creek, 2 people who'd lost their original families in different but equally devastating ways would begin the long, careful process of building something new together, not based on blood ties or social convention, but on mutual respect, shared survival, and the kind of love that grew stronger under pressure. "Will you teach me to ride properly?" Sarah asked as they walked, her small hand tucked securely in Cooper's larger one. "Among other things," Cooper replied with the first genuine smile he'd worn in years. "Reading, writing, arithmetic, how to handle a rifle, how to read weather signs, how to survive in country that doesn't forgive mistakes." "And will you tell me about your daughter, about Mary?" Cooper felt the familiar stab of pain, but for the first time, it was accompanied by something else. The possibility that those memories could be shared rather than simply endured in solitude. "Yes," he said quietly. "I'll tell you about Mary. She would have liked you very much." Behind them, the restored creek ran clear and peaceful in the morning sunlight, carrying away the last debris from the previous day's catastrophic flood. Some things could indeed be washed clean by time and flowing water. Others, the truly important things like trust, courage, and the determination to protect the innocent, had to be rebuilt from the ground up one day at a time through actions rather than promises. But it was possible. Cooper had living proof of that possibility, walking beside him, her resilient spirit unbroken, despite everything she'd endured. They'd both lost family in different but equally devastating ways, but now they had each other. And in the hard, unforgiving country of the Montana Territory, where survival often depended on the kindness of strangers and the courage to do what was morally right, regardless of personal cost, that bond was more than sufficient. It was everything that mattered.